It's a pleasure to welcome Joanna Collicutt to speak to us. Joanna is a great friend of the Revd Institute. One of the research projects that we have at the moment, which is this course has arisen out of that, is run by Alistair Coles, and Joanna is one of the co-investigators on that. Is under the title Mystical Seizures and Salience in Temporal Lobe Epilepsy. And this weekend it rises out of that overall project. Joanna is a lecturer in psychology in Oxford. She's also an Anglican priest and is Oxford Diocesan Advisor for the spiritual care of older people. She's written fairly extensively on aspects of neuropsychology, and it's a privilege for us to come and talk to us this afternoon.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much for inviting me, and I've really enjoyed it so far. And this morning when I was listening to the talks on, well, initially psychosis and then going more broadly, I remembered that I have recently written a book, and there's a chapter in that which offers a theological reflection on some of these issues about the nature of perception that we talked about this morning, and in particular, how to be attentive to the divine voice in the light of what we know about how our perceptual systems work. And as I remember that, I remember I had a few in the back of my car. So I very cheapily have brought them in and put them on the bookstall. So actually the book is mainly about character and virtue and positive psychology, which is something Liz is going to be talking about tomorrow. But there is one chapter in it which looks precisely at the questions raised by, if we come at the world with a set of preconceptions, how do we make ourselves attentive to the divine voice if we think the divine voice can be heard in the natural world? But I'm not going to talk about that this afternoon. I'm going to talk about an approach to some of the questions that we've looked at that starts really with clinical observation. So the stories of people whose brains have been affected in certain ways, and that how this impacts on their spirituality and religiosity. And I thought it was really interesting that we had heard something about Karl Jaspers this morning, because I thought I'd better say, because I'm called the Karl Jaspers lecturer, I better explain who he was. Because lots of people have not heard of him, which I think is really sad. And I came across him as a young psychologist, as a psychiatrist. That's what I thought he was. And indeed he was. He was a psychiatrist who was particularly interested in the phenomenological approach. So when I'm talking to students about phenomenology, I say what that is it's about what it's like to have something or experience something. And he was, I think, an excellent clinician, and had this thing about not rushing to judgment in terms of categorising symptoms, but actually listening and paying meticulous attention to the patient's story, the patient's presentation. So not being driven by your cries, if you like, in the language that we've been using this weekend. But actually he moved into, as polymaths do, into another related area, which was that of existential philosophy. And he taught two people who are now more famous than he was. One was Hans-Georg Gadamer and the other Paul Ricoeur. And this whole discipline of phenomenological hermeneutics arose out of the thought of Jaspers, interestingly. And he honed it in the psychiatric clinic to start with. And then he moved again and became a bit more kind of like Jung, and developed a major interest in mystical experience and the Christian apophatic tradition in particular, and in notions of human transcendence. And I will come back to transcendence later. So I want to start with people's stories and clinical observations. This is a book I wrote some time ago now, and I'm just going to, it's about ethics in brain injury rehab, which is where I worked as a clinician for many years, was in that area. And the book essentially circles around the question of what does it mean to be a human person, and how are we to behave towards people who have acquired brain injury in the light of our understanding of what it means to be a human person. And the book begins with an account of what I say there, an ordinary afternoon in an outpatient clinic. I'm just going to read a bit of it. It's Tuesday afternoon and I'm seeing the last client of my outpatient clinic called Alison. Her husband Brian sustained a severe head injury in a fall 2 years ago. After a long period of rehabilitation, he was discharged home to his family. He needs supervision for most activities of daily living, and he attends a day centre once a week. The couple are in their 40s and they have 2 children. After a discussion of her husband's neuropsychological assessment, Alison tells me that she would like to ask some further questions concerning his psychology. And this case is an amalgam, but it's very strongly based on a real story. She tells me that before the accident, he was a loving husband and a very involved family man. He provided her with a good deal of support. She describes him as a best friend as well as a lover. Both of them had strong religious beliefs and were involved in their local church. She continues, since the accident, he's so deeply changed. It's not just that he has difficulty with walking and his memory is so bad, it's as if he stopped loving us. All he thinks about is himself. He seems to have no emotions except anger if he can't have things immediately. It's like having another child in the house. He doesn't care about the children, he doesn't speak to them except to tell them to shut up. They don't say much, but I've noticed they spend more time in their rooms and they don't invite friends home anymore. He won't make love to me. The other day I told him I was upset about it and he asked me if I wanted a divorce. He didn't seem that bothered about it. I'm so lonely. She begins to cry. She then says, when he woke up from the coma, he was so full of hope. Sometimes now, I wish he'd never woken up. That's wrong, isn't it? She goes on, I could cope with all the medical problems if there was just some sign of warmth or affection from him. There's an old friend of mine, a widower we both know from our church. He's been like a rock to me over the past months. I don't know how I'd have coped without him. I'm starting to develop feelings for him. But that must be wrong too, mustn't it? I've been wondering about what my marriage means. When you make those vows, you promise to stay with your husband for better for worse, in sickness or in health. But what if that person isn't your husband anymore? Brian isn't just sick or going through a bad patch. He isn't Brian anymore. Please tell me what you think. You're an expert. Am I bound by my marriage vows? The book just reflects how awful that is when that happens, and it happens quite a lot, this kind of stuff. She then says, this is something somebody once asked me also, my husband was a committed Christian. He now has no interest in church or spiritual things, and he behaves so badly at times. Will he go to heaven, or has he forfeited his salvation? So that's just, bread and butter neuropsych assessment in the outpatient clinic. And I use it in the book to say that ordinary people are faced with these issues of life, death, meaning, identity, what is the right thing to do, and they're catapulted into these kind of situations, and they don't have the leisure, the luxury of being able to sit and reflect. They have to make decisions on the hoof. And the kind of things that she's saying are so typical of the kind of things people struggle with, and they are around who is this person, especially in the context of post-severe head injury, but that's not the only context in which this arises. We could talk about, for example, dementia as well. I'm going to talk about 4 cases to illustrate and to use to explore this relationship between changes in brain structure and function and issues of spirituality, identity, and so on, soulness, if you like. And the 4 cases I'm going to look at are Phineas Gage, patient HM, Dostoevsky, and the 4th case is not a person, but it's an experiment, a famous experiment, the Good Friday experiment. So here is quite a nice picture of Phineas Gage, who's probably the most famous, I suppose, head injury patient of all time. This is another famous pair of pictures. That's the one on the left is an original, obviously, drawing done to show where that the injury occurred in relation to his skull. The one on the right is a reconstruction by Hannah Damasio, trying to show which brain areas may have been affected by Gage's injury. So, for those of you who don't know about Gage, I will just say a little bit about what happened to him, and to remind those of us who do know about him. He was a 25-year-old railroad foreman working in Cavendish, Vermont, in the USA. He was excavating rock, and in preparation for blasting, he was tamping powder, so pushing powder into a drill hole, when a premature explosion drove the tamping iron, which is the thing that went through his head, which is 1.1 millimetre long and 6 millimetres in diameter, weighing 6 kilos, blew it through his left cheek and out of the vault of his skull with such force that it threw him on his back, and he fell several yards behind, and smeared with brain is the contemporary description. And what's interesting about Gage is that there was a physician who took care of him and was careful to document the behavioural and psychological changes that Gage underwent following this event. And initially he made a good physical recovery. I don't think he lost consciousness actually, but he developed a brain infection after that and was unwell for a long time, but did then make a relatively good physical recovery. And the physician, Dr. Harlow, observes then a change in Gage, and he says, he remembers passing and past events correctly, as well as before, as since the injury, so his memory is okay. Intellectual manifestations are feeble, being exceedingly capricious and childish, but with a will as indomitable as ever. He's particularly obstinate. He will not yield to restraint when it conflicts with his desires. His employers, who regarded him as the most efficient and capable foreman, considered the change in his mind so marked that they could not give him his place again. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, a child in his intellectual capacity and manifestations. He has the animal passions of a strong man, so a kind of lethal combination. And then there's this very famous concluding remark that Harlow makes, that he was so radically changed, so decidedly, that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. So he was, like the patient I described to you just before, the judgment was made he was no longer the person he had been. And nowadays we might say that Gage showed signs of what is sometimes called dysexecutive syndrome, and I put syndrome in inverted commas because I don't think it really is a full-blown syndrome, but it's a loose collection of difficulties which all cluster around difficulties in planning and executing goal-directed behaviour. So impulsiveness or impulsivity, disinhibition, so saying what you're thinking in situations where that's not in your best interests, acting out desires that you really ought to be inhibiting, and so on. Poor self-monitoring, poor awareness, concrete thinking. So people with this kind of problem sometimes perseverate on the same thing again and again and again and again, and egocentricity, finding it difficult to see things from other points of view. And sometimes the issue is that people show a lot of active, disordered, difficult behaviour, but sometimes there's apparently a kind of apathy or a lack of initiation. And these problems are related to prefrontal lobe damage. So in the reconstruction that Damasio put together, you can see where people think the damage was in Gage's case. And the problems are subtle, so they sound very dramatic, but actually they show themselves in very subtle ways in everyday life. People have diminished social skills. You know, if you're talking to somebody and they break off to say, as actually John Cleese does in 42 Hours After Head Injury, God, you're ugly. Which might be something that is subliminally going through one's mind, but which one would never fully articulate. you know, you can see why relationships break down really, 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 really quickly for people like that. We understand these problems as cognitive problems, and yet the impact is relational and emotional. So what you have is egocentricity means it's hard for you to express love, but we think of love as an affective quality rather than a cognitive quality. If you have difficulty inhibiting what we might call lower desires, that's seen as a moral failing, whereas again, you might think of it as a cognitive difficulty. I put as my last point, maybe this is something that is a life of the sarx or the flesh. Maybe that's what some of the New Testament writers mean by life in the flesh, and I'll come back to that hopefully at the end if I've got time. So that's just a very quick snapshot of the sorts of difficulties that people gauge as a really extreme example of this, but this is very common in people who have closed head injury or frontotemporal dementia or frontal lobe tumours. So anything that affects these parts of the brain are to do with the executive functions. Second case, this is really going through these really quickly, but is perhaps the most famous neuropsychological case ever, patient HM, Henry Mollison. He had a very severe, untreatable temporal lobe epilepsy from an early age. And a long time ago now, obviously, in 1953, when they'd exhausted all other sorts of treatment, he underwent neurosurgery to try and treat the epilepsy by William Scoville, neurosurgeon, and his epilepsy was indeed cured. I don't think he had another fit afterwards, I'm open to correction, I think it was cured. But there were lots of unwanted side effects. And they were due to the fact that in order to affect this cure, Scoville had basically removed on both sides of the brain large amounts of the medial temporal lobe. So this is a kind of transparent diagram of the brain, and it's these bits here, kind of inside there, that were removed, large amounts, and a number of structures. But I think we now know that perhaps the most important of those structures in relation to the problems that HM then developed later are the hippocampy, one on each side. And these medial temporal lobe structures are very vulnerable structures. So we have in HM's case, it's a surgical intervention, but they naturally are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to shearing injuries in closed head injury. They're vulnerable to lack of oxygen, and they're vulnerable to infection. So there are a number of reasons why people may develop problems in these structures in their brain. Here's a brain in the head to kind of help you orientate it a little bit better, just showing one side. And here is a picture of HM's brain compared with, and this is now cut down to the centre of his head, where he has holes where his hippocampy should be. And it was as a result of this, an intensive study by a neuropsychologist called Brenda Milner, that people began to put together understandings. I think a lot of understanding of how human memory works actually relates to this case. And the notion of the amnesic syndrome, which I think is much more like a syndrome than this executive syndrome is. So what you have in the amnesic syndrome is preserved. A lot of stuff is preserved if you have damage nowhere else in your brain. So your IQ, your general intelligence, your working memory, that is your ability to hold memory numbers or information in memory for very, very short periods of time. Your general knowledge, that is your semantic memory, on the whole, is well preserved. And your emotional learning is well preserved. That's a very important issue in relation to dementia. And Alzheimer's-based dementia also tends to begin in those structures and presents with problems with amnesia, usually. What is destroyed is the ability to lay down new conscious memories. So you get an anterograde amnesia, that is a problem with putting into memory new information that happened since the onset of the condition. And if you have a proper amnesic syndrome, you just can't learn new things. So HM just could learn nothing in the way of new information. So it was reported that he had lost a relative, and people would have to tell him again and again and again that this relative had died, and each time he reacted as if he'd been told the first time. What is variably impaired in the amnesic syndrome is memories from before the onset of the event, because there seems to be a problem in consolidating and retrieving old memories. And it's usually the earlier memories that are held on to, and as you get nearer to the event, it's more difficult to retrieve those memories, but it can be patchy. And I mean, I've worked a lot with people who have this kind of problem for different clinical reasons, but it's always these structures of the brain that are affected. And if you listen to their stories, they're very touching. You kind of think, well, it's interesting because these people can't do these intellectual cognitive tasks. But what happens is that their lives fall apart because we need to do these tasks in order to lubricate the relationships, oil the wheels of relationships in our lives. So if you imagine, your partner gets home from work and you say to them, well, what kind of day have you had? And they say, I don't know. Can't remember. You know what it's like when you ask children that? What's school like? Yeah. They do tell you kind of later sometimes, it comes out. But actually, if you have a partner who can't tell you that, can't ask you what have you been doing, or if you do tell them 5 minutes later, says, so what have you been doing? That's really difficult. It's difficult to hold things across time, the person involved, so this kind of sense of subjective continuity of consciousness. And then there's this problem with retrograde amnesia, that you actually lose large chunks of the story of your life. So if you get this condition when you're a young adult, it's particularly disabling, because all the work you do over adolescence and time in terms of constructing a sense of who you are kind of has gone to nothing. But I've also worked with people where it's really, really sad stories of people who have long retrograde amnesias, who have perhaps been married twice, and the first marriage has ended in disaster, and then they've met a new person that rebuilt their lives, and this person has helped them through that, and they've come to a happy place. All those memories may be knocked out, and all they might remember is the early days of their first marriage. So they might greet their spouse with, well, who are you? And where's Jenny? And Jenny was this awful woman who turned out to be a psychopath or something. And they've forgotten all that. And the person who helped them through it and who they're now in a relationship with is then utterly kind of excluded from their life. So there's all sorts of kind of social and relational consequences for these kind of problems. This is a picture drawn by a person who I worked with who had this kind of difficulty due to encephalitis, and she writes on the picture this sense of a complete loss of sense of personal identity. And so it raises the question of soulness, if you like. And I'm not going to spend a long time talking about what I think soul might be, but for the moment, I'm loosely saying there's something about the essential me. There's something essential about soulness. And there's this judgment, he was no longer Gage. Something deep about his soul had changed. Perhaps this is what Freud means by Seele, which we translate mind usually, but we could have translated soul if we'd so chosen, one of the first translators of Freud's work. And there's also something about this being the seat of spirituality. So I'm not using soul in a technical sense in the way that it might be used in the New Testament, the word suke. I'm saying in a kind of common sense, psychological way. That's kind of what people mean when they talk about soul. And if we look at it a little bit more analytically, memory for the past and the ability to envision the future are properly, I think, considered as soul functions. So I have a picture of the Eucharist up there, and I'll come on and mention that in a minute. Memory allows us to recall and to tell our story. So continuous memory for the past allows us to recall and tell our story, and new memories help us to build our story in an ongoing way. It gives us a sense of where we came from, and story and memory give us a sense, an option for imagining the world as a different or a better place. So those of you who know the story of the prodigal son, his turnaround, his spiritual turnaround, happens when he remembers something. He's hungry and then he remembers they didn't have bread at home. And memory is essential to this kind of growth. So going back to gauge and executive function, this also has a role, I would argue, in ensoulment. It allows us to move purposely towards a better future. And I haven't defined spirituality, but I think spirituality is related to two things, the search for meaning and the ability to transcend. And memory helps us transcend by showing us options from the past. Executive function even more so. It allows us to move purposely towards a better future rather than being just reactive. And it enables us to transcend our ego. Which, if you remember, people with executive problems have difficulty transcending their egos and caring for others. So there's a past and there's a future dimension to this. And those of you who are familiar with the Eucharistic liturgy, it is very obviously about memory. You know, do this in remembrance of me. Since Passover is the same, more so. There's an act of memory, there's a narrative about the past, but there's also in the Eucharistic liturgy, as there is in the Passover, a look towards the future, the eschatological feast, the final end of all things. And the communion, the act of communion, stands at a pivot between both of those. There's memory for the past, and there's intention and aspiration to the future. So reflecting on this, Rowan Williams talks about the role of memory in spirituality. This is from his book, Resurrection. And he is reflecting on Augustine. And Augustine's idea that human beings are made in the image of God. And how might we know that? And Augustine suggests that just as God is a Trinity, so Augustine's writing from a Christian perspective, clearly, there is a Trinity in humans that mirrors that. And the Trinity is one of memory, intellect, and love. So just go back to this idea that he can't love us anymore, he can't remember anymore. So Williams, specifically talking about the first of those, memory, he says, memory is the self, because it is my presence to myself, the way in which I constitute myself and understand myself as a subject with a continuous history of experience. I am not trapped and confined in the present moment. As a conscious subject with a remembered past, I transcend these limitations. I can understand them, I can put them in perspective, move on from and through them. Thus, whatever stimulates and nourishes transcendence in this sense has to do with presence to myself, and so with memory. Without this, my bondage is complete. It's no accident that long-term prisoners in concentration or labour camps, for instance, have so often felt the need to recover not only their own past, but a whole cultural and religious tradition, a shared past which can genuinely be seen as an alternative and liberating reality. To affirm one's identity, value, solidity, reality in situations where this is being systematically crushed, and he uses the word spirit, is to affirm that one is spirit, and then he backtracks and says, I'm not sure that's the right word. It's to affirm that one is spirit, and this involves owning the recovering of a past and a liberating memory. So there's a sense in which if you have lost your memory, according to Williams anyway, you are imprisoned, and you have lost the spiritual from your life. Next case, perhaps more positive. This is also a case of brain pathology. This is the case already, we've heard about the study that Alistair is leading on, looking at temporal lobe epilepsy and mystical experience. And this is the case of Dostoevsky, who suffered from TLE, had these kind of experiences, recounted them in many of his writings, and we know that other people, including most famously, I guess, Karen Armstrong, have had similar kind of experiences. So just a little bit from him. And this is from The Idiot. So this is a fictionalised, but clearly based on his own experience. These moments, short as they are, when I feel such extreme consciousness of myself, and consequently more of life than at other times, are due only to the disease, to the sudden rupture of normal conditions. Therefore, they're not really a higher kind of life, but a lower. This reasoning, however, seems to end in paradox, and it leads to the further consideration. What does it matter, though it be only a disease and abnormal tension of the brain, if when I recall and analyse the moment, it seems to have been one of harmony and beauty in the highest degree, an instant of the deepest sensation, overflowing with unbound joy and rapture, ecstatic devotion, and completest life. This is an example of not so much the indirect cognitive, what I would call transcendence deficits that come with loss of memory, loss of executive function, but the direct effects of a brain change on spiritual experience. This is a positive one. This is a negative one. This is from an article in the Church Times that was based on a patient that I was working with who had been a very eminent person in church circles and then suffered a head injury as a result of a road traffic accident, and her whole spiritual experience changed profoundly as a result. She no longer felt the presence of God in her life. The relationship was gone. She carried on faithfully practicing her religion, but God had, as it were, left the building for her. Very difficult for her to deal with, very difficult to explain to her faith community who thought she was going through a period of like dark night of the soul or doubt in the goodness of God because of her suffering. And she kept saying, no, it's not an intellectual problem, it's just he's not here. Presumably a direct effect of the injury. The last case is a kind of, if you like, a short-term experimental imposed brain change. This is also a very famous experiment. I suppose the two most famous experiments in psychology and religion are the Good Friday experiment and the Good Samaritan experiment. So this is the Good Friday experiment, carried out before ethics committees were quite so attentive as they are these days, and it was the effects of psilocybin on ordinands' experience of the Good Friday liturgy. So it was a group of seminarians in Boston in the 60s who, it was basically a double-blind control study, or claimed to be, in which half the group were given psilocybin and half the group were given a placebo. It was a bit niacin, I think. And then they listened to the Good Friday liturgy on the radio, and then they wrote about their responses. Almost all the members of the experimental group reported experiencing profound religious experiences, providing empirical support for the notion that this psychedelic drug could facilitate religious experiences. And at least one of them described this as the most powerful cosmic homecoming I have ever experienced. People knew that this was drug-induced. Didn't make a difference. They were followed up many years later, and at follow-up, many of them continued to say that this had been the most powerful mystical experience of their life and had a major impact on their ministry and their faith development. And then it was replicated more rigorously, more recently still. And at 14-month follow-up after the initial study here, over half the participants rated the experience as one of the top 5 most meaningful spiritual experiences in their lives, and considered that the experience had increased their personal well-being and life satisfaction. So this is the manufacture of a disturbance in brain chemistry, has apparently a direct and enduring effect on spiritual experiences. So the first 2 cases were, in a sense, around the sense of identity, which is a key part of our seeking for significance in the spiritual life. The second 2 are more about mystical experience, that we might call the spiritual part of the soul. So, some questions that seem to be raised, philosophical and theological questions. I'm sure you'll sit there for this particular quote, but there's the reductionist question. Does this kind of findings, do they suggest that really we are just brains and that's it? And that all the things we think of as rich, meaningful, mysterious, mystical, what makes us human, and what gives us meaning? Are these actually just epiphenomena of firings of neurons somewhere in our heads? A more pastoral question, which one is asked all the time, and is raised for people by the experience of people with brain disease, and particularly perhaps the most commonly encountered one, dementia. What happens to the essential me or the essential you when my brain is injured, fails, and in fact what happens when it goes? Augustine's notion of this divine trinity raises the question for those who accept it: has the image of God been obliterated if an individual can no longer think or love or remember? I think we're quite good at saying, well, if somebody can't think and they can't remember but can still love, then they're essentially human and spiritual beings. What about people who have these injuries that turn them into really very unpleasant, unloving individuals? What's going on there? How do we make sense of that? And is our experience, the Good Friday experience, just one of many you could offer, is our experience of God simply down to chemical or electrical changes in our brains? So I don't have answers to these. I was saying to somebody yesterday, it's a good thing there's no right answers, and they said, well, there probably are actually, it's that very good. But I just have some kind of straws in the wind that we might play with. So one way that people have tried to address that first question, that reductive question, is to invoke theories of emergence. And we haven't got time, thank goodness, to go into them in depth. And there are many different variants of emergence theory, but the one I'm just going to describe very briefly is Nancy Murphy's variant, which is non-reductive physicalism. But I would say that for all of them, there's this sense that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And they're built on the idea that we are complex entities, and as complex entities, we might look at them as being organised in hierarchies rather than simply aggregates of their components. And as you go up the hierarchy, you get properties that emerge that are not present in the constituent elements themselves. So I think all theories of emergence would postulate that, and probably the next point, that all the processes at higher levels are restrained by and act in conformity to the laws of lower levels. So even though they look different, new aspects emerge, they are still constrained by what's happening at lower levels. So, if you like, mind is constrained by brain, but it's a lot more than brain. Now this is Nancy Murphy's additional one, that those emergent processes can act downwards, top down, on the lower levels. So, to put it in terms of mind and brain, which may not be the most helpful way, but that's how I've done it. We might think that mind emerges from the body and the brain, but it can also act on the body and the brain. So I've given some examples there. Deciding to give up smoking. Functional illness, by which I mean what used to be called hysteria, or like conversion problems, where psychic pain is expressed in physical inability and physical structural changes often. And I think that the lecture we had on pain yesterday actually speaks into that. And the ultimate one, of course, is suicide, when you decide to destroy the thing that is giving you the cognitions and the decision-making capacity to decide to destroy it. Now, I don't think that Jesus was a full-blown non-reductive physicalist, but I do think there are emergence theory has quite a lot to say to us in terms of a number of things in Christian theology. One is in relation to how we read biblical texts and how we understand prophecy, and I haven't got time to go into that, but just to say that what emerges from prophecy is more than perhaps what the prophet wrote and intended, but is in conformity with what the prophet wrote and intended. We might come back to that in the discussion, but I think, a core metaphor that Jesus uses about the kingdom is this idea of the mustard seed, which is something that, in a mysterious and challenging way, is deeply different from the thing that gives rise to it. It doesn't act top down, but it emerges from. Those of you who know godly play the Cogley play version of the mustard seed. And I think play to me is a very interesting and important theological and psychological category. And when Alistair was talking about the van, you were playing. That was the point. You know, we use play for so much, but functional imagination is held in play, but if it's not treated playfully, then it becomes dysfunctional. In godly play, Story of the Mustard Seed, you have to ask wondering questions to the people who are hearing the story. And one of the questions is something like, well, there's one which is, what was the seed doing while the tree was growing? And another one is, if you could take the tree, could you take the tree and squish it back down and fit it into the seed? The sort of questions that children play with, that adults tend to stop asking. But there's a resonance there with some of the more difficult questions that we set ourselves in relation to mind, brain, body, and so on. That was question 1, the reduction question. Questions 2 and 3. So these are the questions about if I can't think, remember, or love, has the image of God been obliterated in me? And what about the essential me? And I suppose I would sum these up as moving outside of human capacities and looking at the concept of grace, talking theologically, but talking psychologically at the idea of, I guess, social construction, if you like, and social cognition. So this is from Psalm 8, and there's a really interesting reading of Psalm 8, which is not this particular verse I have in yellow. This is usually read as the question of, when I look at how big the cosmos is, I wonder why you bother with little tiny human beings, because we're not much, are we? But there are people who read this in a different way, and I think it's an interesting reading, which is the question, what does it mean to be man? Or what does it mean to be a human being? What is it that makes a person a person? And the answer is that God is mindful of them. It's quite different. It places the responsibility of existence and identity not in capacities that the person exhibits, either we might want to describe those in terms of intact brain structure and function, or psychological capacities to act. But actually, it's about the way the person is seen and remembered by God. So just some other biblical texts, in a sense, to flesh that out. There's a repeated theme in the Old Testament of God remembering his people. Isaiah 49, can a mother forget the baby at her breast? You might think the answer is no, but I did leave my baby in the supermarket once, so the answer is yes. Though she may forget, I will not forget you. The question is, whose memory is important in this model? What if I don't understand God? We have 2 throwaway lines by Paul about the important thing being not knowing or understanding God, but being known by God. And actually in teaching of Jesus you get this, I knew you. It's not about you knowing me, it's whether I know you. So there's something about relational co-construction, if you like, of identity there. It's there in the idea of covenant as well. What if I am not capable of loving God? This is from 1 John. This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us. Really important. And going back to executive function, people use the imagery of childishness when talking about people with executive problems. And they say the problem is that, as they said about Gage, that this is a person who has childish impulsivity, need for instant gratification, but they have the body and the desires of an adult. And this is the danger. And there is something in that. If you think about what we do with our children as they grow up, and the frontal lobes are the last parts of the brain to mature, is that we act as their frontal lobes for them until they kick in. So we're the ones who say, don't step in front of that car, don't bang your head, watch out, no, you can't have a whole packet of biscuits. And until, looking at that psychologically, people internalise the voice, but neurologically, their capacity to inhibit those desires grows. So there is something